So if we go back as far as chapter 6, even into chapter 5, it begins to talk about the climate, the things that were going on. After Jesus had died and gone to heaven, there was this growing sense among people that church could be done a different way, that the teachings of Jesus were worth following. And Stephen comes to us in chapter 6 as part of that group of people who were growing, gathering, teaching, listening to the disciples, learning from them. And it also was a time when there was a shift in the amount of leaders that were necessary. Initially, the disciples could cover the load, but as they grew, they began to discover that people were being left out, forgotten, like the widows. And that was a part of Jesus's message, is not to forget them. So they decided that they would choose 7 more people to be leaders or deacons and to tend to those things. So it says in chapter 6 that they chose Stephen, a man full of faith and the Holy Spirit. And then they list the other 6 people just by name. And then it goes on to talk about when Stephen was arrested. Stephen, full of grace and power, did great wonders and signs among the people. And that made the high priests begin to argue with him and test him, if you will. And they secretly instigated against him. And they began to say that Stephen was speaking words of blasphemy. They stirred up the people as well. And they got them all believing too. They confronted Stephen, the high priests, confronted Stephen and began to ask him all kinds of questions, kind of to test his faith, to test whether he was actually using blasphemous language or not. And then the high priest asked him one question. Are these things so? Stephen had been talking about a lot of marvelous, wonderful things and calling to task those things that weren't being fulfilled. And so as he began to speak, he started off by saying, "Oh, brothers and fathers, listen to me. The God of glory has appeared to our ancestor Abraham." And he continues the story of Abraham. And then he said he became the father of Isaac. And then he said Isaac became the father of Jacob. That would be Jacob and Esau, Jacob. And then Jacob was the father of 12 sons. We know them as the patriarchs. Joseph was one of them. His brothers didn't like him so much, and so they sold him into slavery and told Dad a big fat lie about what they had done. Then the story goes on, and we hear the birth of Moses. And many of us hear and see movies during Easter time about Moses. And he was raised by Pharaoh's daughter. But then when he was 40 years old, he wanted to go visit his people, the Israelites. So he went to be with them and visit with them. And eventually he left the palace altogether. And then when 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the wilderness on Mount Sinai, and it was the story of the burning bush. And many of you may have some familiarity with that story. It's where the voice of God said, "I am the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob," and so on and so on. And he told Moses that it was going to be his job to lead the people out of Israel to the promised land. Well, it took another 40 years. So Joseph was beginning to be an old man, and Joseph had become a prominent voice, or not Joseph, Joshua had become a prominent voice. And then King David and his reign. And David had asked God if he could build a temple for him, but God said no. It wasn't time. And then Stephen began to turn it back towards the people who were questioning him, the people who wanted to know if these things were true. And it says, he turned his attention right to them and he said, Stephen said, "You are the ones that received the law as ordained by the angels, and yet you have not kept it." Well, they didn't like that at all. And so they took Stephen, they dragged him out of the city and gathered around him in a big mass of people. And Stephen knows what's going to happen. They're going to stone him. And he does this something that is just remarkable. He looks up and he says, "Look, see the heavens? I see them opening, and I see the Son of Man," that would be Jesus, "standing at the right hand of God." And that really made them angry. They began to pitch stones at Stephen until he died. But right before that final moment of his life, the last words that he uttered were, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." If we go one step further, the first verse of chapter 8, it says, "And Saul approved of their killing." Saul was a high priest, one very learned person in the ancient Hebrew texts. And I think it's important that we remember his role in giving permission for the stoning. We'll come back to him a little bit later. And I have paper. I've just been writing and writing and writing as I think about this. And why is this little snippet of text in there? It's like 3 chapters long, and then and then Stephen's gone. And like I said, everything is contextual. Context is everything. Phyllis Tickle wrote a book called The Great Emergence. It's how Christianity is changing. And in this book, she talks about every 500 years or so, there's a great shift in Christianity. You know, about 500 years ago was the Great Reformation. And then 500 years before that, the Great Schism. And then the time of Gregory the Great was 500 years before that. It's a time for something new to emerge. I believe that life after this pandemic that we're in will be very different from the life that we knew before. It'll be interesting to see in what ways this pandemic time shapes our faith, our beliefs about God, our role as a church. This pandemic has been huge. Its impact is on not just one area, it is on the entire human population. And in this impact, so much of what we see is negative. We see the loss, we see the mishandling of preparation and execution of distribution of resources in the world, in our country, and inequities that show up between class and race. It's easy to see a lot of negative. But there have been a few positive things that have come so far. a reprioritized value on teachers, medical persons, people who clean and sanitize. People go out and howl at 8 p.m. across the country. Why? One reason is to let the healthcare workers know that we see them and that we offer our support. The howling is not pointless. The second thing is a benefit for us as people as well. When we howl, it's primal. So in our offering of support to others, we also let go of some tension inside of us, a moment of lament. Another thing that's positive is people are staying home and driving less, and Mother Earth has been able to let go of the pollution that hangs over us. Our skies are clearer. Our lungs are freer to breathe more deeply. And there are songs of hope on YouTube. There are messages of hope in many different forms. There are photos filled with family moments that brought great joy. These are some of the positive things that have come from this stay at home or safer at home, or however your area defines, don't go outside and mingle with others. But Stephen's story, what's positive for that? And I say it's probably different depending on your perspective. People were being stoned. Some people, the text tells us earlier in Acts, that when people got bold in their delivery of the message, that they would be disappeared. They would be stoned. They would be silenced. But Stephen's focus wasn't on what was going to happen to him. His focus was on maintaining his connection to God. Oh, I see the heavens open, and I see the Son of Man standing at the right hand of the Father. And his last act was one of forgiveness. Please don't hold this sin against them. Oh, Stephen, your story of faith, it touches us. That moment when Saul was standing there giving permission for the stoning, I imagine that action troubled him, but it also inspired him. And a few chapters later, we can read of the story of Saul being called by God and given a new name, Paul. And Paul becomes an important figure in Christianity because most of the New Testament after the Gospels was written by Paul. His letters, his writings have informed Christianity throughout the ages. Oh, Stephen, we thank you for your witness. Even in the midst of difficult times, God shines through. Oh, Stephen, thank you.